Hello everyone, Juxtaposition here. I wanted to include some footnotes into my previous video today regarding what I would refer to as an unholy alliance between Stanford University, which is legally called Leland Stanford Junior University, and Sequoia Capital across the road on Sand Hill Road, and with FTX and other corporations that were created either on the Stanford campus, like Cisco Systems was, or with Stanford alumni, or with people that attended Stanford but didn't graduate, or with people who went to Princeton or Harvard or Columbia University but had alliances with Stanford University. For example, George Shultz, former Secretary of State under the Ronald Reagan administration and also president of the Bechtel Construction Company, he lived on the Stanford campus and was a fellow in the Hoover Institute. So there's a perfect example, and I'll be getting back to George Shultz in a moment. That's a person I personally spent time with, had a cocktail with him, and watched him be the master of ceremonies for the hijinks night at the Bohemian Club. Now that's quite amazing looking back at it, because George Shultz, as a master of ceremony over a night of jollification with a bunch of men and not a single woman present, in the basement, a windowless dungeon of a clubhouse with a bronze owl with the caption that reads, "Weaving spiders come not here." And if you can imagine me being in a theater in a basement below Taylor Street with George Shultz, who I just had a highball with, and he's up there, master of ceremonies, reading the jokes that were prepared by the NBC Tonight Show staff. He had the NBC Tonight Show writers writing the script for hijinks night to celebrate the July weekend at the Grove. The last 2 weeks of July, they have the what's called the summer encampment. There's a number of names to coin it. There's also a production there. There are two productions. There's Cremation of Care, and there's also a performance theatrical act in the Grand Dining Room Amphitheater, where that typically they'll spend $250,000 to $1 million on the production of that show. Where one member told me that they've killed tens of thousands of soldiers on that amphitheater stage, just cut into the hillside where they denuded it of redwood trees in an otherwise redwood rainforest. So they cut down the trees to create a dining area complete with candelabra, acetylene candles on picnic tables. It's sort of like, if you can imagine, the Boy Scouts of America on steroids. That's what I would call it. All right, so wanted to caution you people not to jump to conclusions. You know, I got a lot of I'm aware of a lot of hatred over at YouTube regarding anything to do with Samuel Bankman-Fried and or the polyamorous amphetamine using Caroline Ellison, if you believe any of that stuff. Because, look, I don't believe any of that stuff, all right? I don't know them personally. I know that Sam Bankman went to the same school that Patricia Hearst went to. And if you remember that story, she got kidnapped at age 19 from UC Berkeley and then was living in Nancy Pelosi's neighborhood for over a year, and nobody could find her. And then later she was convicted of bank robbery, which is a federal crime, and she was represented by F. Lee Bailey, the man who got an acquittal for O.J. Simpson. So O.J. Simpson gets released for a double murder, but Patricia Hearst is convicted for kidnapping, and she's the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst. So, and they're both represented by the same attorney, who I'm going to call a CIA attorney. Anyway, I want you to know that the Charlie Manson story falls into this category. Susan Atkins and Charlie Manson, who that's not his real name, his name is Scott. But my point is they're completely innocent scapegoats that didn't harm a fly. And for all those people out there that jump to conclusions by reading CIA authored books like Kurt Gentry's Helter Skelter or Lawrence Schiller of Pepperdine University, his book The Killing of Sharon Tate, that was copyrighted on January 2nd, 1970, before the Los Angeles police knew anything about Charlie Manson murdering Sharon Tate, this knucklehead comes out with a novelette on the subject. So I'm going to call poppycock on everything that you think you know about the Charlie Manson cult family. Just forget about it. It's all made up. It's complete mendacity. And that's really true with Elizabeth Holmes, who's another Stanford student who didn't graduate, right? I mean, don't pick on Elizabeth Holmes. When I tell you her background, you'll be quite disturbed, I'm sure. You'll be surprised. But John McEnroe, professional tennis player, he didn't graduate from Stanford. Everybody loved John McEnroe's tennis, steroid tennis. Everybody loved steroid golf when Tiger Woods played it. He attended Stanford University, and he didn't graduate. John Elway played in the NFL for a long career. He took steroids, and he attended Stanford University. And they must have a steroid program at Stanford football, right? And then they got a swimmer at Stanford that raped one of their students. Brock Turner, July 18th, 2015, look it up. He was convicted of sexual assault, 3 felony counts that he was found guilty of. I don't know if he pled guilty or they had a trial. Anyway, Elizabeth Holmes was just sentenced to 11 years in federal prison for federal fraud in federal court for defrauding investors. So that sounds really bad. It has to do with her startup company, Theranos, if that's what it's called. Let me just get into the Elizabeth Holmes real quick, like a bunny rabbit here. Okay, this is why she came to fame, right? There's a backstory, which I'll get into. Theranos, the now defunct health technology company that soared in market valuation after the company claimed to have revolutionized the blood testing by developing methods that could be used surprisingly using small volumes of blood, such as from a finger prick. It was featured in Forbes magazine back in 2015, and they named Elizabeth Holmes the youngest and wealthiest self-made female billionaire in America on the basis of a $9 billion valuation of her company. I'm not sure what percentage she had. But just so you know that Elizabeth Holmes didn't come from under a rock, and if she did, it would be a CIA rock, okay? And that would be the same story. Look at Sam Bankman-Fried. His parents are teaching law at the Stanford Law School. I mean, that's a big red flag. And little Caroline Ellison, who's a graduate of Stanford University, and her parents are teaching economics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the home to Noam Chomsky for decades, while he talked about fake history and applied linguistics, where he tried to bamboozle everybody into being confused about what our real history is, which we have a military-controlled maritime law system. I never heard Noam Chomsky tell the truth about that. I never heard him talk about it, because he's all about diversion, deception, and chaos. That's what Noam Chomsky is all about. And that's what MIT is all about when you go into the social science area, aka anthropology, aka applied linguistics, which is the warfare weaponization of liar, liar, pants, and forty storytelling. Much in the way that William F. Buckley did at Yale University when he became the captain of the debate team and skilled in rhetoric. But if you ever watched William F. Buckley in real life, you'd see all he does is change the subject and demonize his competition. He never ever addresses any topical area because he doesn't know anything about any topical areas. He just knows how to distract people from the facts. And that's what applied linguistics is. It's a form of evading the truth. It's concealment. It's the art of concealment. It's getting your audience to just get exhausted and give up. But you should know that Elizabeth Holmes came from Houston, Texas. Now, what was in Houston, Texas when this young woman was born? I mean, she's very, very young. Okay? I mean, today she's 38 years old and is going to be spending a minimum of 5 years in prison unless Sleepy Joe Biden pardons her. Which, by the way, that's a distinct possibility that a president of the United States will pardon Elizabeth Ann Holmes, who was born on February 3rd, 1984. She's 38 years old today. Okay, so she's very young to be involved with this fraud. What about all the bankers that didn't get convicted? Remember there was something called Enron? Remember Enron? And then Ken Lay disappeared, died up in Vail, Colorado or something like that. You know, he was the CEO, president of Enron Corporation. Well, guess who else worked at Enron Corporation in Houston, Texas? Well, that would be Elizabeth Ann Holmes' father. Yeah, Elizabeth Holmes' father was an executive at Enron Corporation, which is an accounting fraudulent subsidiary of General Electric. You know, the company that Ronald Reagan represented for over 12 years. GE brings good things to life. Well, they brought Ronald Reagan to life. They brought Ronald Reagan along so that he could be the governor of California, the fake governor, and then he could be the fake president of the United States for 8 years. He was sponsored by General Electric. And that's who profited mostly from Enron. General Electric plucked over $13 billion out of that fraudulent enterprise before it imploded like FTX did. It's a pump and dump scam, people. It's to do several things. One is to enrich the perpetrators and with ill-gotten gains. And number two is to destroy or shake the confidence of investors, real investors, not fake investors, real investors who saved in their pension money and their IRAs and through hard work. When they lose their money, they lose interest in the type of investment. So if it's cryptocurrency, then that's going to be bad for the cryptocurrency sector. If it's in the oil sector, which Enron allegedly was, but it was really a fake simulation trading company, it would shake the confidence of people that traded futures in the energy sector, right? But anyway, Elizabeth Holmes, of all places, she was born in Washington, D.C., which is a disturbing swamp to be born in, February 3rd, 1984, born in Washington, D.C., and her father's name is Christian Rasmus Holmes, and he was vice president at Enron Corporation, an energy company that later went bankrupt after an accounting fraud scandal. I know a lot about that scandal. And do you know the accounting firm, auditing firm of that firm is the only CPA firm that sent me a rejection letter? Arthur Andersen. Arthur Andersen had me back I had 3 interviews with Arthur Andersen in the San Francisco office. And then they sent me in a rejection letter. I mean, why did they reject me after the first meeting or the second? Oh no, I had to go to 3 meetings and they wasted my time. How wonderful it is for me to not work for a company where I would have become unemployed because of accounting fraud with Enron, where Elizabeth Holmes' father worked. Does anyone see the humor in this? This is little Elizabeth Holmes, a little girl. She attended St. John's School in Houston, Texas. Her mother was born in Georgia and was French Canadian. Oh, gee, that reminds me of other French Canadians who came to this country and were infiltrated into Hollywood, like William Shatner was, like Neil Young of Toronto, Canada, polio survivor was. You know, who else have we got? Don't we have Stephanie Powers, who was the 9-year girlfriend for William Holden, who was murdered in his apartment in Santa Monica? Yeah, she came from French Canada. Stephanie Powers, I believe she came from Montreal, which is French Canada. And that's where Yoko Ono and John Lennon had their honeymoon. His first honeymoon, her third honeymoon. And they were joined by Timothy Leary, a career CIA LSD maven, tune in, turn on, drop out, in Montreal, Canada, at the Hotel Elizabeth. The Queen Elizabeth. Hotel Queen Elizabeth. Anyway, Elizabeth Holmes attended Stanford University, where she studied chemical engineering as a student, researcher, and laboratory assistant in the School of Engineering. Now, she was enrolled in what's called a Mandarin Chinese home tutoring program And this is how she made her way to Stanford University. And then at the end of her freshman year, where allegedly she tells us she was raped on the Stanford campus, after she had that rape happen to her, she was sent off to the Genome Institute in Singapore and tested for several respiratory coronavirus products, where she tested syringes there. This is before the coronavirus deadly virus had broken out. Elizabeth Holmes is in Singapore testing coronavirus, which I think are flu viruses, and SARS-CoV-1 in Singapore. And it's there that she meets a much older man, an Indian man. Stay with me. This is disturbing, people. We already know that her father was a vice president at Enron. That should make you nervous. And she was born in Washington, D.C. That should make you doubly nervous. Anyway, then she goes to Stanford University, where she claims that she got raped. I don't know what Stanford has to say about that. Maybe if they had attended her fraud trial, they would have heard all about her testimony. I'm sure you can get a copy for a couple of $100. I think they charge about $10 a page for testimony in a public trial. You know, and they won't tell you how many pages of testimony, Elizabeth, and they won't edit it. So you got to get all the days of testimony. This is probably going to cost about $10,000 to get all the actual spoken sworn testimony of Elizabeth Holmes on the witness stand. Probably going to be 10 grand to get that testimony. I know the media is not interested in it because they're interested in concealing this entire fraud, the real fraud. Because let me just get on here to tell you that I'm trying to find before the fraud began, she's being groomed, right? Her father works for Enron. Then in June, let's see, then she goes off to Singapore as a part of Stanford University's genome program. And she meets up with this gentleman. Okay, got it right here. She becomes romantically involved with the technology entrepreneur Ramesh Sunny Balwani. By the way, he was also convicted of federal fraudulent crimes. I believe the same counts that Elizabeth was. Anyway, he's a Pakistani-born Hindu, and he immigrated to India from Pakistan and then here to the United States. She met him in 2002 on a trip to Beijing, which was part of Stanford University's Mandarin program that I referred to earlier. Elizabeth Holmes was only 18 years old at the time, and she had just graduated from high school, whereas this Rajmeesh Sunny Balwani, he's 19 years older than her. All right, so he's 37 years old. And he's married. He's married to another woman at this time. But then later in 2002, Balwani divorced his wife and then became romantically, I think they were romantically involved before the divorce, people. Anyway, they become romantically involved. And in 2003, about the same time that Holmes then dropped out of Stanford, the couple moved into an apartment together in 2005. They moved in together, not married. Although Balwani did not officially join this Theranos therapeutic fraud until 2009, where he became chief operating officer, and he was advising Elizabeth Holmes behind the scene, allegedly, if you can believe any of what I'm reading you, which I believe very little of what I'm reading. Anyway, later she said he was dominant in the relationship and bossed her around and was abusive to her and sexually abused her at times, and he wanted her to become a new Elizabeth, not the old Elizabeth. Meanwhile, you got Forbes magazine pumping up Theranos stock in much the same way that Jim Cramer did on CNBC for FTX. You see a parallel here that the Elizabeth Holmes story with Theranos is exactly the same to a T script that FTX with the front man known as Samuel Bankman-Fried is. It's exactly the same. And I can assure you that Elizabeth Holmes does not control the media, and neither does Sam Bankman-Fried, and neither do his parents at the Stanford Law School. They don't control the media either. You know who does? The CIA controls the media. And if they want your cryptocurrency to go up in value, they can make that happen. If they want your Theranos therapeutics products to go up in value, they can do that. And they do that. And if you don't believe me, why don't you call over to Sequoia Capital at 2800 Sand Hill Road and ask for Doug Leone, because I think he knows that. He's worth $6 billion. I think he's keenly aware of how to value a portfolio. And I tell you to call and ask for Don Valentine, but he died like right after Aaron Valente died. It's just another coincidence, I guess, on Sand Hill Road. Anyway, what I'm trying to tell you is that Elizabeth Holmes was groomed to be a scapegoat for this life science debacle, which was hatched at Stanford University. Kind of sort of like Sam Bankman-Fried was hatched at Stanford University, and where Caroline Ellison matriculated and graduated in mathematics from Stanford University to go on to be the chief executive officer of Alameda Research. And she's an alumni of Stanford University. Well, anyway, getting back to Elizabeth Holmes, when they started this, she needed founding, right? She needed funding. She didn't have any money. She's a young woman. And her new husband, this Indian, much older man, he doesn't have any money. So guess what? They get money, right? You know, Sean Stone always says you got to follow the money. I always tell him, hey, it's hard to do that because the money comes from money laundering, and you really need to follow the bankers, right? That's why I like to follow around Don Valentine and Jerome Kohlberg. I like to follow them around because everywhere they go, I see military-industrial complex wherever they go. Anyway, what I want to tell you is that first, in 2003, Elizabeth Holmes founded a company called Real Time Cures in Palo Alto. That's where Stanford University is. To, quote, democratize healthcare, end quote. She described that she had a fear of needles, blah, 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 blah. All right. In 2003, Elizabeth Holmes renamed that company being Real Time Cures. She renamed it to Theranos, which is means therapy and diagnosis, which are two different things, by the way. Therapy is one thing, diagnosis is a different thing. Holmes was an admirer of Apple founder Steve Jobs. Well, he's a prodigy of Don Valentine and Sequoia Capital, so of course she would be. Maybe she had a secret meeting over there at Sequoia Capital, you think? Because they certainly promote Steve Jobs and turtleneck sweaters. They're a big believer in that. They do think you should wear shoes to meetings and not sandals. But this is important. You need a board of directors. You need a board of directors if you're going to be on a publicly traded company, right? And guess who one of the first board of directors was for Elizabeth Holmes Theranos? George Shultz. George Shultz, who's living on the Stanford University campus and is a fellow of the Hoover Institute. So he becomes, I believe, the very first director of the Elizabeth Holmes Life Science Company. And he lives on the Stanford campus, which was taken away from the Ohlone Indians. And he works for CIA because he was the State Department in head of all provisional housing for CIA agents worldwide, global. And he was the CEO of Bechtel Construction, which is a military industrial contractor, global. And he lives on the Stanford University campus. And guess what? He knows people in the venture capital private banking business. I know that for a fact because I had a meeting with him and the president of the World Bank, and we were all sipping cocktails together. So I know he knows the president of the World Bank. And last I checked, that was kind of an important position, right? So George Shultz, he knows people at the elite level of banking. And he's on the board of directors of Elizabeth Holmes Life Science Company. And guess who else joins the board? Like dominoes, they all fall rather quickly. Because along with George Shultz, former Secretary of State for Ronald Reagan. Oh man, you're not going to believe this list of luminaries. All right, so there's just so much poppycock here, it's hard to get through it all. Every single person that's on the board of directors of Elizabeth Holmes' company are influential figures, and they all have CIA connections. Tim Draper, he wrote a check for $1 million. He's a Silicon Valley venture capitalist. You can't be a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley unless you're State Department CIA approved. And turns out that Tim Draper is a personal friend of Elizabeth Holmes' childhood friend, Jessie Draper. I guess it's her father. All right. And he wrote a check for $1 million. Then we have George Shultz joining the board. Then we have a 12-person board, 12 members. They are Henry Kissinger. You might have heard of him, right? He used to be on the board of directors for Gulf and Western, which controlled Paramount Pictures, and Roman Polanski. And Robert Evans, not his real name. His real name is Robert Shapira. He's a Jewish guy from New York. Anyway, Henry Kissinger is also on the board of directors of the Rand Corporation. They held the lease for Abigail Folger's home in Laurel Canyon, 2774 Woodstock Road. Henry Kissinger was on the board of directors for the Rand Corporation. That's CIA. That's a CIA think tank. Henry Kissinger joins George Shultz, who's CIA. And Henry Kissinger is CIA. And he's Harvard also. He's a Harvard alum. George Shultz is Princeton alum. Then we have former Secretary of State William Perry. So he's CIA too, because George Shultz is CIA, and so is William Perry. So I've got George Shultz, CIA, Henry Kissinger, CIA, William Perry, CIA. Then I have Secretary of Defense James Mattis, that's CIA. Future Secretary of Defense Gary Roughead, that's CIA. He's retired U.S. Navy Admiral. That's definitely Navy Intelligence, CIA. Then we have Bill first former United States Senator, Republican from Tennessee. You can't be a senator of this country without CIA clearances. That's like Diane Goldman Feinstein, for example, age 89, still a senator from California. How's that work? Hey, she was mayor of San Francisco. It's a CIA city. She only got her job because George Moscone had his head blown off by an operative known as Dan White, right? Harvey Milk, George Moscone murdered in a CIA city where Nancy Pelosi celebrates weddings now. She presides over weddings in the building where Harvey Milk and George Moscone had their head blown off by allegedly Dan White. Then we have Sam Nunn. You might have heard of him, Republican from Tennessee. Well, he's CIA approved. All right. And then former CEO Dick Cavendish of Wells Fargo. Well, I don't want to say too much about Wells Fargo other than it's a disgrace. It's a disgrace. And then Riley Bechtel of the Bechtel family. Okay, well, that's definitely CIA because they're global approval and they made a boatload of money in, Vietnam, not to mention all over the world wherever the CIA has offices, right? So what I'm trying to tell you is Elizabeth Holmes' board of directors is all CIA agents, all right? And she didn't use her own money. And guess what? At FTX with Sam Bankman-Fried, it's the same story, okay? It's the same story. And the media wants to tell you about Caroline Ellison, her polyamorous life, and her amphetamine addiction. And they want to talk about, the crazy Charlie Manson hairstyle, which looks a lot like Angela Davis's hairstyle. Sam Bankman-Fried is this evil person who torpedoed cryptocurrency. Are you kidding me? It's a CIA operation. Obviously, it's a CIA operation. Used a CIA bank. Don Valentine? He's CIA. Just call over and talk to Doug Leone. I'll bet he's not going to answer your questions. Anyway, so I wanted to throw that in here. And later I'm going to do a video on Diane Goldman Feinstein where we have a very similar background when you drill into the background and you see older men that she married. She's gone through 3 husbands. I think all 3 of them are dead. She's 89 years old. Why is she a senator? Why is Joe Biden the president? Why do we have a cackling cacophony of chaos? Kamala Harris is a vice president, 1 heartbeat away from being the fake president of the United States. Oh, where is General Electric's Ronald Reagan $6 term president of the Screen Actors Guild. Where is his .22 buntline pistol? You know, the one that was not used at the Sharon Tate murder scene? But there were 7 bullets out of M16 rifles that were discharged at the crime scene on Bella, which has been renamed Cielo. All right, well, that's my point today, people, is that Elizabeth Holmes is going to spend a minimum of 5 years in federal prison unless she can get a pardon. I'm sure they're working on that. They're also working on a new trial. But you got to see that she was completely owned and controlled from childhood. Her father worked at Enron. Her first board of director member was CIA, George Shultz, followed up with Henry Kissinger. So you got Princeton and Harvard sitting on Stanford University's crazy life science company. Elizabeth Holmes, Theranos. Thanks for listening. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.